for this opportunity to give this talk in the Stockholm seminar series. So I want to talk about this paper that is part of something we did last year. It's a result of several years of cooperation, and it builds on data that's been collected over the last 20 or 30 years ago. So it's a nice, to me, a really nice opportunity to be a part of a really big group of Seabird researchers, and it was also really nice to see how all these different efforts that have been carried out in the North Sea and elsewhere for the first time, when all these data from around the world were put together, what kind of interesting patterns emerged from that. Okay, so I want to zoom out a bit first with, you're always supposed to do a literature review when you do a study, and this is some aspect of that literature review, because when I talk about seabirds and the effects of changing ecosystems, I think one important aspect is how we use marine ecosystem. And this publication to the left is The Freedom of the Seas, written by Hugo Grotius in the 1600s, that pretty much laid the foundation for our perspective of how we use the sea. It talks about the freedom of passage, and it's also sort of formed the foundation of the right to use marine resources for anyone, anywhere, in any way. And that's pretty different to the way we use many resources on land, where we have more defined user rights and a different tradition of use, basically. But this sort of the freedom of the seas and the perception that marine resources are inexhaustible has sort of for a long time shaped our way in which we use these resources. And I think parallel in many ways to this freedom of the seas in the 1600s is this book by Jonathan Franzen on freedom, published last year. And this is a book that deals with freedom in a very different way, but it talks about the changing society in North America, in the US, from the 1970s until today. And it talks about freedom and the consequences of that freedom. It talks about if you're an individual and you're exercising your freedom, that freedom would have consequences for other people. And if you're a country and you're exercising your freedom, that would have consequences on other countries. So it talks about the different aspects of freedom at different levels of society and the consequences of that on other levels of society. And the reason I talk about this is not only related to the freedom of the seas, but also related to the very strong desire in human societies to exercise freedom and some of the consequences of that. And of course, one really important historical event quite recently, in September 11 in 2001, is something that we, working with natural resource management, we're increasingly seeing the really important key aspect that this has had in international relations, dealing with marine resources. It's very evident in the Antarctic, where sort of these geopolitical changes triggered by the 9/11 events really changed the landscape there. And it's also really interesting to see how national security aspects is also shaping some of the work that Per Olsson and Franziska Rosen is doing in the Coral Reef Triangle. So the 9/11 was really a key event that shaped the way we can deal with marine resources, and we're just starting to understand the impacts of that when it comes to intelligence sharing and changing relationships between countries. But just to emphasize that, and I'm afraid you can't really see it too well in this picture, but this is an excerpt from the George Bush address to the nation after the attack. And what's interesting, I think, is that he very much talks about freedom. There's some famous quotes here about the aggressors hating the freedom, and what is at stake is not just America's freedom, but the freedom of the world, and so on. So if you, and Andrew, helped me put together this sort of wordle of all the different words that are used in this address to the nation, and freedom comes out as a really strong concept. So I think when it comes to international relations and the way humans perceive what we're doing and our right to do things is very much based on our perception of expanding our freedoms and fearing constraints in our freedom. And I think the scientific endeavor, to some extent, is also driven by the concept of freedom, the freedom to leave the ground and fly, or even up to space, freedom from constraints of creation by pretty nice sheeps like Dolly, or the Green Revolution to improve our livelihoods, or some of the more recently emerging technology to exercise sort of freedom of the constraints of the planet, to sort of manipulate planetary processes as a means to address some of the downfalls on recent development. So again, what has this got to do with anything, you may ask? Well, I think looking at the cover of this book, there's a lot of birds on there. And the whole text freedom is also made up on birds. And birds are to a large extent, a very commonly used symbol of freedom. So in many ways, birds symbolize this freedom, and I want to talk a little bit about the freedom of the seas and our perception of seabirds, because they do not only symbolize freedom, they are to a large extent one of the easiest things for humans, I think, for us to relate to. A lot of the things in marine ecosystems is happening underneath the surface, and to many people, in many movies and so on, when you want to give the perception that you're close to the oceans, you always use seabird as sort of an indicator of that. So seabirds are an important link between us and marine system, because they're so easy to see and if you compare it to all the things that's going on underneath the surface. So seabirds then, what are they? Well, there are very many different seabirds. This is a common guillemot, and I don't know, can we dim the light a bit maybe in front, or can you see okay?
Yeah, it's down.
Okay. So these guys, for instance, this is a picture of when these birds are flying. You can see that they're not. So
if I take this down, it will
sure.
sound a bit.
Okay.
Like that.
Yeah. Okay, so these common guillemots, you can absolutely tell that they're not optimally designed for flying. They have really high wing loading, meaning that they can just about fly pretty much. And if you watch them, such as this is pictures taken from Stora Kosa, when it's windy, they're all flopping around and they have a hard time navigating, and they live on these narrow ledges, and when it's really windy, they have a hard time landing, and they're crashing, sometimes falling down. And there was one time when on top of Stora Kosa there's a lighthouse, and then there's a fence around that lighthouse. So one time I was up there trying to just taking a walk at night, and there was one of these guys that had been sort of blown in and crashed on top of the island in the lighthouse, and didn't have enough room to move. So I was standing there with his head out the rails there and couldn't really get out. So we had to lift it up and get it out. So it's it doesn't really fly that well. So it looks like kind of like a geek when it's flying around. But on the other hand, you can't perhaps tell that well, but this is the same species, but flying underwater. And instead of flying with its wings in front like this, as it does in the air, the wings are shifted back like this, and you can really see how perfectly adapted it is to diving and flying underneath the water, where it dives and pursues prey all the way down to, normally 40-50 meters is not a problem, but they've been observed diving all the way down to 100 meters. So these are incredibly skilled birds as divers in pursuit of prey, but not as well performers in the air. So they have sort of made some interesting trade-offs when it comes to flying and diving ability. That makes them really interesting. And of course, penguins can't fly, but they can dive really deep and so on. So there are very many different strategies of seabirds. And they also have their central place foragers, meaning many of the seabirds at least, meaning that they have one colony where they lay their eggs and the chicks grow up, and they have to go away and catch prey and bring that back. So they're constrained by the amount of prey they can bring back to the chicks during the breeding season. And then after the breeding season, they go out and spend most of the year offshore. So they're part offshore, part onshore animals. So they have a combination of being on the water for several months at a time, in the breeding colony for some months at a time. They can both fly and dive, at least many of these seabird species. And they also occupy very many different habitats. As I mentioned, many of them stay on very narrow ledges where they balance an egg and actually do a really good job at that. They use very few eggs every year, it seems. So there's also, of course, penguins, as many are familiar with, breeding in some of the most extreme environments on the planet. And then there are also puffins and many other seabird species that dig their own burrows. So they live in these tussock grasses, and they sort of create this more or less elaborate houses or places where they lay their eggs and are well protected from predators. So they also have very many different strategies to protect themselves from predators, because a lot of times gulls and other species come and prey on their eggs or chicks. But they're very well protected down in these burrows. And when I started working with seabirds, I worked in Triangle Island in British Columbia, which is pretty much just a rock made out of tussock grass, and there's no trees. And we were working with some of these burrowing seabirds, and we were checking nests, and you really have to sort of get your hand all the way back in the nest, and they sort of dig them out with their feet, so they're pretty elaborate. And once you get the eggs, you could feel that it was warm or not, and so you knew it was, if they were watching it or not. And a lot of times you could feel the feather of the adult bird, and then you knew it was only half a second or so before it was going to hurt a lot. And these guys have really, these kind of, what is it called, bullseyes. They have they're pretty strong beaks, and it really feels, especially when you get them, when they get you here, it's not as nice. So you have crap out to your elbows and they hurt you, but it's still a really interesting job and fun. Okay, so again, here are just some examples of different species again. This, like the common guillemets you saw, they can only go out and take one fish at a time, because it has to fish down like this, and then it comes back to the colony and throws up the fish to their chicks. These guys, I'm losing the word in English here. The puffins, yeah. They carry their fish this way, so they can carry a lot more fish. Then you have the penguins that go out and sort of swallow it and can take it down a lot more. Then you have the blue-footed boobies, and you have terns and gulls that also prey on fish. And like the penguins and the puffins, they can really dive deep, 50, 60, far more than 100 meters. Whereas the terns and the gulls, they can just sort of skim the surface. And I want to also show you just an example of an interesting forage technique is from gannets that can't really dive, but they still do. It's related to the booby there. So these are gannets, probably filmed off the west coast of South Africa, that sort of do this bomber plane strategy. So they can't fly under the water like this, but they use the force from diving down. You can see them folding back their wings to get really good speed down there. And then they circle these schools, and then when the schools that a lot of times are driven up to the surface by dolphins, or close to the surface, they really down synchronously. Now, one of the meetings we had for this work was in South Africa, and we were watching this big group of gannets, like 200 or 300 birds, and they all dive down at the same time. So it's just really fun and impressive to look at them. See, they go down pretty far. See, come on. So that's just one foraging strategy, and then there are a lot of different types of techniques. And seabirds, you can pretty much find them everywhere. This is an estimate of the distribution globally. You can see there are large concentrations in the Southern Ocean, large concentration up here. So it's sort of the productive southern and northern areas are areas where there are also large seabird populations. Up here and also on the Peruvian coast and all along the North American coast there as well. So seabirds are pretty much everywhere. Many of them have delayed reproduction, so they don't start breeding until they're 4 or 5 or even later years old. They also live until they're really old. So when the conditions are bad, maybe they will refrain from breeding, and that's not too much of a problem perhaps, unless if that conditions are bad for several years at a time. But they're really sort of have a common strategy among all the birds is that the adult mortality is very critical for their long-term survival, and that's why problems such as bycatch when seabirds drown in fishing gear is very critical, because if the adults die, then you have a hard. That's really affecting the population sustainability. They work pretty hard since they have are adapted to very extreme environments. Many of these species are working very close to their energetic maximum due to they're working in very cold environments or dive really deep to secure resources. And as I said, they have delayed breeding, so they don't start breeding until they're a couple of years old. And although they have very different strategies and although they live in very different places all around the world in different types of habitat, most of these species, or almost at least all of the ones I showed here, they use forage fish. So most of the time, these really small, fat fish that's sort of in the middle of the food web. These are really high energy, really high fat lipid contents, and really high protein content. So these are the kinds of fish that will enable these birds to live in such extreme energy demanding environments. And forage fish is influenced a lot by climate variability, but also fishing pressure. And forage fish have in general a very different strategy than seabirds. They don't live until they're very old. They start reproducing when they're very young. So they have a more rapid turnover and more dynamic populations a lot of times than do seabirds. And forage fish are these guys here in the middle. And there are different ecosystems that are subject to different types of control. Some ecosystems are a lot driven by bottom-up control, where sort of the environment is influencing phytoplankton production, in turn influencing zooplankton production, and influencing forage fish, in turn having an effect on large fish, sharks, mammals, and seabirds. But there can also be a lot of ecosystems are strongly exerted by top-down regulation, where sort of the top predators are influencing the dynamics all the way down. And then this is a paper by Philippe Curie a few years ago, when he also talked about this wasp waste control from his work in Benguela, the coast of southern Africa, where sort of the dynamics of the forage fish population is really shaping through sort of cascading effects down to the bottom of the food web, as well as up to the top predators. So these dynamics can change over time, and Michel Cassini has done some really nice work recently illustrating how we change in the Baltic from bottom up to top down control. So they're not only different in different ecosystems, they can also change over time. And what's critical is that, of course, that forage fish is a very key component of the dynamics of very many of these ecosystems. And in addition to this image, of course, there's also human impacts on top predators, but also increasingly on these forage fish. So this is a graph that's was done by Daniel Paul and his group, where they estimated sort of the global trends in fisheries, and I'm sure many of you have seen this picture before. But it illustrates from the 1950s the very rapid increase in fish catches due to increasing technology and increased demand for fish. And then as we're sort of reaching the maximum capacity of what marine ecosystem can produce, the catches do not longer increase despite us using novel technology, using deeper fishing areas and expanding to new places of fishing. And there's this really nice paper by Trevor Branch et al. A few months ago, illustrating the really continuous increase in new fisheries being developed, but there's really no added profit or no added biomass taking out of the systems. It's very clear that we are reaching the boundary conditions of marine ecosystems with some variability, of course. What's really interesting in a forage fish perspective is these pelagic fish. That's mainly the forage fish. So these small fat pelagic fish are an increasing part of the total fish production. And you have the Peruvian anchoveta that stands out. That's also one of these really fat, small forage fish. But it stands out because that's a very large bulk of the total catch that is anchoveta. So the pelagic fish is a big part, and then ground fish is the cods and the haddocks and all those large fish. And this graph illustrates exclusively only the forage fish that are taken out. And these are some of the areas where this paper by Anthony Smith et al. Also last year published, looking at sort of the global increase in forage fish catches. And in this study, they modeled the potential ecosystem effects of a continuous increase in forage fish. And it was very clear from the ecosystem models they used from these regions that if we continue to catch forage fish and increase catches, that will have pretty substantial ecosystem consequences. But that was only a modeling perspective, so I'll talk a little bit about our studies that are more empirically talk about some of the implications of a perhaps continuous increase in forage fish catches. So forage fish are, I'm missing a slide here, but okay. Forage fish is, what is it used for? Well, it's a really important ingredient in aquaculture because it's an important protein source for aquaculture. And here you have from the 1970s until 2008, the bars here illustrate the really rapid increase in aquaculture. And as you perhaps have heard, aquaculture now represents more than 50% of total human consumption of fish. So we're moving away from using primarily wild-caught fish as food to increasingly using aquaculture as food. And of course, since aquaculture uses a lot of forage fish for production, the future development and trend in the aquaculture sector is really critical for determining demand of forage fish. Forage fish is used also as a protein source in the meat production system and so on. But that development has not been as dramatic as this one. So the aquaculture industry is really an interesting and rapidly increasing development. Norway, as many, of course, have heard about, as a very large aquaculture producer, but it only constitutes 3% of total world production. A very large portion is in China and East Asia in general, but China in general stands out as a very large producer of aquaculture. So it's not only, of course, the total production of aquaculture that's important, it's the type of resources you use to produce that aquaculture. And this is an estimate published in AMBIO a few years ago by Mark Mertian and Takun, I'm not sure his first name, but it describes in the 1990s they have calculated this fish in, fish out ratio. So the red part of these circles is fish protein, so primarily these forage fish, and the yellow thing is other kinds of proteins used. And you can see salmon up there, primarily fish protein as part of the production. And for every kilo of salmon in 1995, they estimated they used 7.5 kilo of forage fish. By 2005, that had decreased 5.4, 2008, 4.9. So if salmon production can become increasingly effective and use other alternative sources in their production system, they can reduce their the total demand to 2020 of forage fish down to 1.5 kilo per every kilo of salmon produced. So you can see it's a pretty rapid development potentially that would reduce the amount of forage fish required. Then you see there's a lot of different species that have very different types of requirement. But there's also, you can see carp, filter feeder that's, or the non-filter feeding carps that use a very small proportion of forage fish, but that could also be reduced. So the total demand and the types of species you produce and how you produce those species have a large impact, of course, on how much fish protein you need to use to produce these and how much you can sort of decouple the aquaculture production system from wild fish resources. So who cares about this? I think birds are not only they don't only have a symbolic value, and I think many people appreciate birds and find them interesting. There's also a large and growing ecotourism sector that benefits a lot from birds. Not only these really extreme Antarctic tourism, but also ecotourism in general and bird watching is a big sector in many regions. They're also are really interesting and increasingly used as indicators. In the North Sea, cooperation on the North Sea, they have 15 or so different ecological quality objectives that they use to measure the state of the marine environment. And 3 of those are directly related to seabirds. And these seabirds are not only good because they can use them directly to measure how much oil pollution is there, how much plastic pollutants are there, and how much toxic pollutants are there. They're also serving another purpose, and that is in more capacity building and understanding ecosystems. Because since a lot of people are interested in seabirds, you can use those as sort of messengers to tell an interested audience in other aspects of the ecosystem. And from the Baltic Sea, we have done that quite a bit. We had some observations of seabird dynamics in our colony Stora Karlsson, I talked about it before, and we can use those observations to understand what is happening with the forage fish, how is that affected by changes in the cod stock, and how is the fisheries and climate and nutrient production influencing sort of the zooplankton and the entire dynamic. So it's sort of the top-down, bottom-up, wasp waste kind of story that I talked about when it dealt with forage fish dynamics. We also use seabirds as sort of a starting points for telling the story of how the Baltic Sea works. And we find that this has been a really easy way to get people attention and to get new people interested and learning more about the ecosystem. So they're not only direct indicators of change, they're also sort of indicators that they can be communicators basically for learning more about the ecosystems. So forage fish, of course, are really important as well. Produce a lot of important ecosystem services for both as feed to other species in the marine environment, but also in our food production system. And from the wasp waste top-down, bottom-up, it's also very clear that they produce a number of really critical ecosystem functions. And the analogy in the Baltic Sea is that seems to be that the forage fish dynamics, the sprat, has really seem to be influencing perhaps even the nutrient levels in this area. So they're producing a lot of system functions that we're only starting to unravel. So what is the connection then between seabirds and forage fish? Well, together with Olof and a couple of Torsten Lenkner and Bob Furness, we published this paper in Oikos a few years ago, when we looked at all the published data that had seabird data and fish data, and we looked at trying to understand how big what kind of relationships there were. And what we can see there was that the circles are sort of abundance studies, and that's the majority of the studies, is that changes in fish numbers have impact on some aspect of seabirds. It can be breeding success or adult survival or very many other seabird parameters. Then there were a couple of studies that also showed that the quality of the food also made a difference for some of these parameters. And then there were a few studies that also show that food abundance is influencing survival of pups, of fur seals and some other fur seals, I think, as well, on the Peruvian coast. So the amount of food seemed to be the most studied parameter, and it had an influence on several seabird and some mammal parameters. So this was a sort of a first synthesis of trying to understand what kind of information is there out there. And then of course the question is, what does this relationship look like? Most of these studies, they showed some kind of linear relationship between the amount of food and the amount of, on the output of some variable. So there will be sort of a nice, the type 1 response, some kind of linear relationship. And these are sort of the Hollings type 1, type 2, and type 3 responses. But then there were a couple of studies that had a lot more data that were indicating that there seemed to be maybe a type 2 response where there is a threshold somewhere under which conditions change a lot. But really, by the time we published that study, there were only one Alaskan and one Norwegian study that indicated that maybe some kind of type 2 response. And all the other studies had been, when they were published at least, showed that there seemed to be type 1, some nice simple linear relationship there. So what we did, and that's not thanks to our work in Stockholm, but I think thanks to our work in Stockholm, we were able to work with many of these people that have been actually doing some of these data collections and published many of the papers that we looked at in the OICUS paper. And Philippe Curie, who you perhaps remember, was part of publishing this wasp waste things, together with Ian Boyd. They were part of a Pew-funded forage fish task force when they had as an ambition to learn more about the forage fish importance in marine food webs, because forage fish has not been that important for that long. So since they're so increasingly important in the aquaculture industry, there's been a lot more research going into forage fish. But the ambition of Ian and Philippe was to understand more about the ecosystem function, and the first step to do that was use seabird data, because a lot of seabird data has been collected in a lot of colonies over a long time. And then then we had colleagues from Norway, South Africa, the North Sea, New Zealand, Canada, people working in Alaska, and California as well. So I think we had together 400 years of data from all these different colonies, and it was all published in this study here. And it was nice because the location we did this study in, or one of the studies, there was first one meeting in French that I was not part of, and then there was a meeting in Cape Town where we sort of wrote up most of this, the part of this paper. Was located right next to a penguin colony. So we had, I don't know if you can see it, but there were sort of penguins hanging out all over the place. So it was, to us seabird researchers, exciting. Here you can see the puffin again with quite a lot of fish in its mouth. So again, that's a very different strategy from others that can just catch one at a time, like the gannets you saw diving and others. But anyway, here, this is a map of some of the colonies, and it to some extent mirrors the other map, because there's a lot of studies that have been carried out here in the Southern Ocean, Southern Africa, massive amounts of studies in the North Sea, Northern Norway, Alaska, and California. And here you see some of the species that are used. Here are the gannets again, penguins, common guillemots, or common merce as we call it in the US. So these are alcids, same as the puffins, alcid family, and penguins and gulls and other. And these are all forage fish feeders, but very different strategies and very different locations. But all these studies also have, all these studies have long-term time series, 15 years or longer, and they also had forage fish estimates in close to their colony. So they knew not only what was happening with the seabirds, but also what was happening with the forage fish. And the focus of this study was to look at the breeding output. So how many chicks, or how well are they performing when it comes to production every year. And putting all these data together, normalized so they were comparable, we had the prey abundance down here, so how much forage fishes are out there. And here's the normalized breeding success, so how many chicks are they producing per breeding pair. And when we put all that together, these are all the different colors from the different regions, but species pooled. What was clear that there seemed to be a distinct threshold here at around 1/3 of the maximum observed biomass. So above the threshold, there were not very large changes in breeding success, and below the threshold, breeding success started to decline quite substantially. So this was what had been sort of indicated in some studies, as I said, in Alaska and Norway, was really emphasized by this graph here, that there seemed to be a type 2 response with a threshold rather than a linear relationship. And when we looked at the variance of the breeding output, it was clear that when you're above the threshold, it's more stable and there's not a lot of variability in breeding output. But below the threshold, you get a lot larger fluctuations in how well they are performing. And looking at the respective regions separately, or the different species respectively, it was really surprising to us to see that the location of the threshold seemed to be pretty much the same regardless of where you're studying or what species that you're looking at. That was to us a really interesting aspect. And of course, the practical implications of this is that if you want to have sustainable seabird stocks, you should be maintaining forage fish above this level. But if you start pushing forage fish stocks below this level, and you do that for several years, of course, then you can start expecting declines in breeding output and eventually negative effects on the population. So to us, this study is called 1/3 for the birds, and although the birds do not by far eat 1/3 of all the fish that's out there, it's clear that they need more than that 1/3 in order to successfully forage and successfully raise their chicks. So to us, this indicated that we can now at least suggest how hard we should be pushing these fish stocks when we develop fisheries for them or the aquaculture. Of course, the aquaculture demand is one thing, but if you have something where you can sort of relate to the ecosystem function, on the other hand, you can understand what trade-offs you're doing. And some of the studies that at least Ian Boyd had been who was part of this group, indicated that there may be a similar response for mammals. So it may be, and the threshold may be at the same location. So there's some indication at least that if we can maintain forage fish above this level, we will not risk negative ecological impacts of increased fisheries. So does this matter at all, and does it influence our freedom? I think the concept of the planetary boundaries that I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work led by Johan and with a lot of collaborators, where they estimated sort of the planetary capacity to sustain human stressors when it comes to climate change, acidification, nitrogen cycles and biodiversity loss and so on, clearly indicated that for some of these stressors, we're pushing systems way beyond their capacity at the planetary level. And some, like ocean acidification, we're sort of still in the safe operating zone. But I think that it's very clear that the freedom to use planetary systems regardless of taking into account that function, we've exercised that right to the point that we're now risk compromising the entire system of the entire function of the Earth system. So I think if we can start developing more of these sort of rules of thumb and more general understanding of when systems are approaching tipping points, then we're probably in a much better position to understand how we can manage not only the Earth system, but only sort of separate parts of that system and different regions to in a more sustainable way. And the really nice threshold that was very similar regardless of system indicates that there are, or there seem to be at least, some simple rules of thumb that you can identify perhaps to ensure that you stay away from these thresholds. So where do we go from here then when we have this first understanding of how these systems work? As I said, this was just one parameter, breeding success, and many of these studies have looked at a lot of different parameters. So So we have a lot more data that we haven't even started using. And also that the journal article in Science, it had a lot more parts of sort of the real policy implications and how you can use these, what the policy implications of these findings really are. But those were, as a result of the internal wisdom of the reviewers and editors, cut out of that manuscript. So we will, in Alaska in July, we're gonna revisit these data and meet again and talk about how we can use the ecological data to understand more of the different, why do different species have different population sizes in different regions, and how is that related to forage fish and so on, and really address some of these more fundamental ecological questions, which I think we can do with some of these data. And we'll also be looking a lot at sort of the policy implications and try to design more practical guidelines and understand what the practical implications of what would happen if we would apply these guidelines to fisheries in different regions, and how could they be operationalized. So those are sort of two tracks that we will continue to develop in this group. And then we're also planning to meet in Stockholm maybe later this year, but more likely sometime early next year, to continue working with this group. And to me, this is a fantastic opportunity, not only to produce great science, but also to, many of these people that I work with are pretty much my idols, my favorite seabird researchers. So this has been a fantastic opportunity to learn from all these people. And of course they have such an enormous knowledge of these systems and species, but also an incredible amount of data that can really contribute to our general understanding of not only seabird forage fish interactions, but also a number of other interesting fundamental ecological questions. So I'd like to thank Martina, Jonas, Olof, Ebba, who I work with together in the Stora Koso project, and all people working in the field. We also have, during ringing in the Baltic, although our time series were too short to be included in this study, we have a lot of data from that region as well, and there we use a lot of volunteers, and their assistance is very much appreciated. Koso-Jakt och Djurskyddsförening and the County Administrative Board and Gotland is helping us a lot, and WWF Sweden has been funding us for 15 years almost now. And nobody else thought seabird research was interesting, at least not some not-named institutions at Stockholm University. So we had a hard time funding this stuff, but I think WWF should really be acknowledged for continuously funding us. And of course, the Stockholm Resilience Center admin and communications team are doing really critical work for helping us when it comes to press releases and web news and so on. So that's something that I really appreciate. All right, and this is a common Gilbert just ring, ready to go, taken off to sea, where we'll meet up with his parents and take off to go foraging, unconstrained by sort of the having to be at the colony, but it can take off regardless of where the fish stocks are and learn how to feed itself. All right, thanks very much.